Hey, it's Zoe, and welcome back to the show. My question for you this week is, can kindness really be a force for good in business, or do nice guys finish last? Let's find out. On Planet Human, some really interesting news from Neuralink this week. They have decided or are working on building the computer brain interface implant to help cure blindness. Now, this is a sensational headline, of course. And when you read the article, which I'll link to in the show notes, it goes through a lot of the hurdles that are in place to make sure that this thing actually can deliver. And there's some confusion as to how much vision can be restored with something like the Neuralink. And these things have been tried before. But the difference with Neuralink is the amount of electrodes that they're going to be implanting through the Neuralink device. And so it's hoped that with the bigger network, they'll be able to tap into different aspects of the eyes and connection to brain to make it more effective than other projects. So I think what's interesting about this is, and what it's signaling to me, is that we are just accelerating on this track to amplified humanity and amplified biology. And this is going to have big impacts on how we choose to show up in the world. Will we get enhancements to remain competitive with our enhanced colleagues or not? Will there be two streams of humans, the natural biological ones and the amplified humans? I think it's a fascinating conversation. And I think it's something that we need to be across and have an ethical stance on, or ethical questions to explore what the ramifications of all this amplified biology are. So that's Planet Human. On Planet Zoe, Olympus Rising is in the home stretch. This is book 3 of my Gaia Enterprises series. And this was a really fun novel to write. I think I wrote it mostly in flow. Like, it just kind of flew off my fingers into the computer. And it's been doing the rounds with the different editors, and we are kind of into the finishing straight. This still takes ages to get all the typesetting, proofreading, and stuff done, but I'm aiming for an end of November published date. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I've been doing some actual work on Power Games, my next nonfiction book, which I'm going to launch as a Kickstarter next year. And that's coming together. I've almost finished the first draft, and it started out as a mess, just ideas scrabbled all over the place, drawing on my various research projects and the interviews that I've done. But it's looking pretty substantive and substantial. So I'm excited about that. The other thing that's coming up is the Leadership Conclave. That's my in-person event for leaders who will come together for a day to look at what's over the horizon for 2025. We'll examine some of the core trends and make some positive intentions, I guess, to run deliberate experiments through next year in response to these particular trends and activities. So it's a great way for you to bring you and your team along to do some big picture thinking in a very concentrated form to make sure that you're actually staying abreast of what's happening, and rather than getting caught in the wave after the fact. So if you have trouble taking time out to do some big picture thinking, come and do it with some others and get some ideas from other organizations in different fields who are coming together to do this work. So that's at the Leadership Conclave. The link is in the show notes. What if and how might we? What I'm looking at this week is, I've been pondering this conversation I had with Dr. David Cooke, who's lovely and fabulous, about what if we started to evaluate businesses on their contribution to social good and not just their accumulation of wealth. How might this change how business leaders and teams show up around their work activities? I think it would change considerably. And there is, of course, a big movement towards that in things like B Corp, et cetera. And yet, if it became legislated, if it became mandated, if it became the default, what kind of society would that be? Now, I'm not so naive to think that kindness triumphs over all, because everywhere we go, we take our shadow with us. Where there is kindness, there is cruelty. We must ever be vigilant that we don't sway into the shadow. And this takes two things, I think, when it comes to thinking about business for good or even people for good, is that in monitoring whether or not we move into the shadow or not, it requires a lot of self-regulation first, to be mindful of self and where we might be on the tipping point to going into our shadow when we think we are walking in the light. And it's one of the themes that's come up again and again in the research I'm doing for Power Games, is that most leaders or most individuals who show up to work believe they're doing the right thing. They believe they're showing up as a hero in their own world. None of them really believe that they are the villain. And yet we can show up and have villainous behavior. And it's the shadow that can suck us into that. And in the book Power Games, I explore what are the contributing factors in our personal world and in our structures and systems at work that create this experience of moving into the shadow. So the first aspect of making sure we don't go down the shadow path is self-regulation. And the second one, as I alluded to, is around systems regulation. How are we monitoring and managing the systems at work that can either amplify good in the workplace or allow the shadow side to ramp up and rear up on its ugly heels? Whoofs. Anyway, that's what we want to do: self-regulation and system regulation. Food for thought. My guest today is absolutely lovely. I met Dr. David Cooke, oh my goodness, at least 10 years ago. I think we were in a presentation or skills development workshop together, and we sat next to each other in the workshop, and I got to know a little bit about him and his business. He's actually been on the show before, and it's nice to have him back some 5 or 6 years later to talk about what's progressed in his world. He is the former chair and managing director of Konica Minolta in Australia. He is also the founder and executive director of ESG, hang on, make sure I get his title right, ESG Advisory. So now he works with other leaders and teams to help embed ESG, environment, social, and governance principles into their workplace practices, transforming cultures and business practices. Very cool. And we talk extensively about how to do that. He's also author of his latest book, or his first book, Be Kind: How Values Create Value. Without further ado, here's David. All the way from beautiful Byron Bay, here for tea talk, tea time in the office kitchen, the fabulous David Cooke. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Zoe. Lovely to be here.
And we were just reminiscing, when did we first meet? And it was 2014. So as we record that, that is a decade ago. And a lot of water under the bridge is what you said as we just clicked record. And yeah, a lot happens in 10 years. And you've just published a beautiful book, Kind Business. And I was very excited to see that book launch. And I've been enjoying the read. It's beautifully written, beautifully researched, and it's got a very compelling message. And the message is that business can be kind, and we can integrate it into the fabric of everything we do. So how did we get to this point, David? How did you come up with the idea of selling that idea of business being kind? Because we don't often hear it in those terms.
Yeah. So, look, specifically the title and the use of the word kind as a description of business was a very a deliberate choice.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, interesting, the story was I took my car for its annual service. I live in Byron Bay. I took it to Ballina. A little shuttle bus dropped me in town, and they said, well, we're going to text you in about 3 or 4 hours, and we'll come and pick you up. And I was literally sitting on a park bench with my laptop. And I sort of had this nagging thought in the back of my mind that one day I should maybe write a book about what I'd learned in the business world. And I had this thought that I wanted to bring in the element of kindness as being a norm in business, being the default, and how effective that is in terms of achieving commercial outcomes when you do that. And so I opened up my laptop and I thought, I wonder if anybody's ever written a book called Kind Business. And I popped that into a search engine, and nope, no books. In fact, I couldn't even find those two words up against each other. And I struggled to find kind and business in the same sentence. And I thought, I think I'm onto something here. and that's when I settled on the title. And then I just started tapping away basically. And a year later, out popped a book.
Oh my God. I know people would say, yeah, that sounds all very easy. We know book writing is not that easy, and it has a lifetime of work and research to go into it. The idea of kindness in business is not something that's just innovative that you've plucked from the sky. It's something that you've lived assiduously with every cell of your being. And I knew that from the moment that I met you, that you were a kind man and a kind leader, which is why I wanted to interview you on the show 5 years ago, I think it was. And can you tell me a little bit about your leadership philosophy and how you implemented that in business when you were managing director at Konica Minolta here in Australia?
Well, thank you for those very kind words, Zoe. Um, Look, in a way, I see myself as an accidental leader. Um, my my appointment as the managing director of Konica Minolta um, was a very curious occurrence in that for 40 years, this Japanese technology company, which, by the way, uh, competes in the same space as better known brands like Xerox and HP and Canon and so on. Um, had always had a Japanese managing director, and they typically come out on 4-year terms, and at the end of the visa, they'd go back and be replaced. And but on this particular occasion, um, the delegation came out from Tokyo to the annual conference, and the usual announcement of a new managing director. But this time, the person on stage said, and we are appointing David Cooke. And I was already there as a general manager in the company, so people knew me, but they never expected that I would be made the managing director, or any non-Japanese person would.
Mm.
And that's kind of where it all began. And I suppose to be true to myself, to be me and bring, we have this expression in business these days, bring your whole self to work, to bring my whole self to work and be able to still be me and not adopt some sort of strange, different mantle now that I had the most senior title in the company. I just had to continue in the vein of trying to um, respect the people that I worked with and everybody really in my ecosphere. And we often use the word stakeholders. It feels a little impersonal to me, but
Mm.
anybody in managerial positions will have people as diverse as those who report to them, their peers, perhaps people above them, the board, um, suppliers to the company, regulators, customers. There are a lot of people in your life when you are in the corporate sphere. And my philosophy always was just be yourself and in a way treat everybody the same. And when I walked up on stage to acknowledge my appointment, I hadn't written a speech. I don't really write speeches, but I turned to the audience and I said, there are about 300 people in this room, and I said, I want us all to work together to build a company that cares about the people who work here, that cares about our customers, and that cares about our community. And that just became the framework or the guiding mission statement, if you like, as to how we ran that company for the next 8 years.
And that's very different to a lot of other leaders. And I think I really want to dive into the contrast, right? Because we hear a lot of leaders that get into, I just had a recent interview also with another leader who talked about this failing in some leaders where they finally get in the leadership chair. They have all this authority and they want to make changes and they want to make their mark. And it's a very different kind of energy than saying, I want to build a company together with you, a company that cares. Very different message to like, I'm going to put my stamp on it. I'm going to steer the ship this direction and we're going to kick goals and achieve results. What do you think? Well, you have a premise that kind business can win for profits. The other ones who want to kick goals and achieve results through this one unilateral, unidirection kind of approach. Why do you think your approach, kind business, works better, does it, than this I'm in the power seat now, follow me?
Yeah. Great bundle of questions, and we've probably
Yeah,
got about
sorry.
three.
There's a
No, no,
bunch in
it's
there.
fine. Absolutely fine. I love it. And we've got about three podcasts worth of material there. But
Mm,
in a nutshell, to answer your question, what you described, and your previous attendee on a podcast described, is very, very common.
mm,
And it's an inherent mistake as people move up the leadership ranks. And it's possibly a learned mistake because I've observed the people above them who were also making a mistake. And that is when you get into a leadership position, you then have to act in a certain way. You are expected to be tough, often adopting very masculine qualities, and that you also need to be all knowing. So you can't show any fallibility because you are at the top, you are running this company, and everything is down to you as to whether that company is going to be successful or not. Nothing could actually be further from the truth. And it's a great shame that somehow we've taken the qualities that might be more associated with um, an historical military leader going into battle, and
mm,
we've sort of transferred those over into the corporate world, or the world of running any organization. It could be civil society or government, or whatever. But it's very, very common. Whereas in actual fact, I mean, what I was saying on that first day, the first sentence out of my mouth was that we're in this together.
mm,
That was that message.
mm,
And, if you don't mind me putting a little bit of my own stamp on this, I'd like us to be a company that cares. But the very next morning, I walked into the office for the very first time as the managing director, and I wrote to everybody across the company. It's about a 500 person company, Konica Minolta. 400 initially, 500 when I left. And I said, look, not everybody was at the conference. A lot of the people were dealers at that conference who they weren't, Konica Minolta team members. And I said, this is the vision statement I made. There's only one problem. I don't actually know how to achieve it, and I need your help. So what did I show there? I showed vulnerability and possibly humility as
mm,
well. Now, some very powerful things occurred when I did that. People didn't say, oh no, they've picked the wrong person. He's really weak. He doesn't know what he's doing. The odd person might have thought like that. But the vast majority of people found it incredibly refreshing that I was being open, I was being human, and I was letting them into my world, and I wanted to be in their world. And we ended up sending out a survey tool. We used a small boutique consulting company called Market Culture. We sent out their tool, and we got 800 responses from, at that point in time, 400 people in the company on ideas, things that they thought needed to change. Now, they'd never been asked for their opinion before because in a Japanese company, it's very hierarchical.
mm,
Um, and they were, and there must have been an element of trust in me for them to willingly respond like that to a voluntary survey. We had over 90% response rate to this voluntary survey. And as I say, all of these ideas. And I didn't delegate those ideas off to somebody else. I read every single one, and I was able to go back to them and say, "These are the number of responses we got. Thank you very much for taking your time. I've read every single one. This is a summary," and they tended to fall into a couple of major categories of change. And we, as in everybody and myself, just set about changing the culture of that company. It wasn't top down. If anything, it was more percolating up and showing them the respect that their ideas were being implemented. And I had to overcome a bit of nervousness in our senior executive ranks because they
mm.
said you can't ask people what they want. They're all going to ask for pay rises and ridiculous work conditions and things like that. And I thought, no, I don't think they're going to. And they didn't. They didn't ask for stuff for themselves.
Mm,
They were just genuinely wanted to improve the company. And to me, that's leadership. Leadership isn't being aloof and distant. the leader up on the pedestal. Leadership is working with people.
That culture change, well, that's kind of a radical change, going from hierarchy, which I visualize as triangles, into this collective, which I visualize as circles, is not an easy shift, though you make it sound like woo, everybody jumped in, boots and all. How did What happened? Did the culture move from this top down to this collective bubbling up, as you describe it, easily? Were there pockets of resistance? Did you have to restructure? Okay, I got to stop asking 5 questions at once. I'll stop there.
Yeah, they're great questions. Kind of all of those things. Um, Now, as you said, I made it sound easy. It was relatively easy. People say cultural change takes 10 years and so on. That wasn't really my experience, I think, because I engaged everybody and listened to
Mm,
everybody. So I had a couple of benefits there. One is that I had 400 brains thinking about this problem, not
mm,
just me. You've got to be way ahead of the curve if you do that. And the second thing is that um, people were participating and were building something that they were contributing to. But to your point, not everybody got on the bus.
mhm.
And one of the anecdotes I mention in the book is my regrets that there was one situation which I possibly could have handled better. And that was a senior female manager in the organization came to me and said, I don't like the changes that you're implementing. And we sat down and we talked at length, and I talked a bit about my business philosophy. I talked about the fact that I was implementing ideas that were coming from within the company as well. I talked about our financial results have been very, very poor up to that point in time, improving, but yeah, it's a really tough, undifferentiated market. It's largely hardware tech market, and we talked at length, and I wasn't able to persuade her to give it a go.
What was
And
I'm curious. What was she what did she dislike or disagree with?
she didn't want anything to change because within the old regime, she had carved out a niche for herself and her two supervisors within her department, and they survived very nicely. They did very well. I mean, I'm not talking about um, earning levels or things like that. They were pretty happy with what they'd carved out. People left them alone. They did their thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there were no challenges in
Mm-hmm.
their life, um, uh, and nobody was asking to think differently or behave differently. And I was. I was asking everybody to, and I was challenging myself to. And so I lost three female leaders in one day, very early on in my tenure. And
I
I intuitively, I felt I needed more female leaders because I needed to take it from this very male-centered way of thinking to what I felt were possibly more feminine qualities of caring and of kindness and what have you. Um, so um, so there was resistance, and I didn't always manage that as well as I could have, but I was still learning myself.
There's a bit
Um,
of an irony there, David, though. If you felt like you lost 3 female leaders and then you went, I need some more female leaders. What, yeah, or yeah, I it doesn't sound like they were resisting a male hierarchical domination structure, because that's what they'd been resisting before, and that's exactly what you were not espousing. And it was less about gender stuff or power stuff. It was more about resistance to change. If I got that correct.
Yeah, I think that is correct. That is
Okay.
correct. It's resistance to change. It's like we don't want to have to go through the pain of change. We haven't changed anything for years. Why should we have to do it now? Well, actually, just on a pure commercial bottom line sense of the company not being profitable, there was a massive imperative to
Mm,
have to change.
mm,
But in their part of the world, they weren't affected by whether the company was profitable or not.
mm.
They had a function isolated from that. But um, but what I did was I just set about initially picking some low-hanging fruit. So one thing was that people said that they wanted better communication.
Mhm.
It's probably a bit of a cliche, but boy, we really needed better communication. There's pretty much none. So one of the things I'd never really liked when I was on that executive level reporting to the Japanese managing director, was that one of my peers, the head of HR, and also another, the head of legal, um, although we were largely open plan, apart from offices for managers, they had built what was known in the business as the compound. And this was, they were completely isolated and walled off. And at times the door was locked, separating themselves from everybody else in the company. And they said that they needed to because HR matters and legal matters were very sensitive, and they had their life behind that wall. Um, literally day one, I went to our facilities guy and I said, get a quote on knocking the wall down. And we knocked the wall down. I went
Yeah.
respectfully went to the people and told them why I was going to knock their wall down,
Mm,
but we knocked it down. We opened it up. We let the light in, and people felt more connected to the department looking after people, namely HR, than ever before.
mm.
Um, the managers had grey film on the glass on the front of their offices, so the people in their departments couldn't actually see them. Um, I went to all the managers and I said, I'm going to take the film away, and this is why I'm doing it. Um, and so we took the film away. So we did some very physical, obvious, notable things to immediately improve communication, visibility, and accountability across the company. And again, that just got more of a groundswell from that bottom of the pyramid, if you like. And that's why I didn't find it so hard, because I always felt very supported by the majority of people in the company.
And for those who lost their status symbols, because it is a status symbol to be walled off, to have your own compound, to have this, privilege of privacy, how did they respond? Were they some of the ones that walked, or were they went, okay, they sucked it up and moved on?
So not immediately, but over time, and I'm trying to think how long it took me. But let's say over the next 6 to 12 months, I pretty much changed that executive team.
Mhm.
So the people who were my peers on that top line reporting to the MD. I sought to work with them, but over time I realized in the majority of cases, I needed to actually, I wasn't going to get the change that I wanted, certainly not at the pace that I wanted. And so a number of people parted the company and
Can I
I
get
replaced them.
can I dig into that a little bit?
Mm.
So is that, I want to understand that, because we often hear about that new boss, new executive kind of thing. And in the context of the shift that you were trying to make, going from hierarchical to collective, from bottom up, consultation, egalitarian, were the team members, reflecting on it now, were the team members there very happy in the hierarchical power dynamics? And what they resisted was the shift. I mean, a couple of things you've said indicate that perhaps the loss of power, loss of status, which is implied in the change, is something that they didn't like to swallow. So can you speak a little bit to that? What was it about the change that they found so irksome?
Well, there's two things, and it sort of goes back to the three women who I lost as well. Simply change per se.
Okay.
They didn't want to change anything. Um, and and in actual fact, I don't think they were capable of living up to the um, the description I had of what we all needed to be as leaders. They were probably quite good functionally in their roles. Um, you know, finance person could add up,
Yeah.
marketing person knew a bit about marketing, operations person was good at operations, etc. But what I was on about is that we have a unique responsibility as the most senior people in the company to be responsible for every aspect of the company. So firstly, they weren't working closely together. It was
Okay.
a very siloed organization.
Yep.
That's one of my visions. We've all got to put our egos aside. We've got to work together. We've got to listen to our colleague. We've got to accept ideas. We've got to go to our people and say, give me some feedback on me. Do you think I'm doing a good job? Aren't I doing a good job? Tell me one thing you'd like me to change about my management style. I drove all these kinds of initiatives. And for a lot of people, that's really uncomfortable stuff.
Yeah.
And so, although we started the podcast with, I might have given the impression that it was all warm and fuzzy and we're building a kind company. Still, leadership at times also requires a bit of toughness and a bit of courage.
Mm,
And if I went to these people and they said, "Well, David, we know all your pink and fluffy philosophies, but we're not in. We haven't bought in. We're going to do it."
mm,
So they never said those words, but they kind of did through their actions.
yeah.
And I said, "Oh, okay. Look, I don't want to rock the boat, and I do want to love everybody, and I want to be kumbaya here. So I won't push you." That's not leadership. That's anything but leadership. So I
Mm.
think leadership has to have that dual edge of courage and kindness at the same time, and you have to know when to use which one.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, being kind doesn't mean being weak. And
No.
I think people often get that wrong. The other thing I'm curious about too, David, is, go through the reform. You want to institute a kind business. You've got all these great ideas. You start implementing, you do these symbolic things where you knock down the compound in the gray film and you have a turnover of your executive. So at that point, can you explain to me how power is exercised in the business at that from that point? Because going from a command control, everybody understands that. How does power look and feel like in a reformed business with kindness at its heart and central premise?
Well, I think the key ingredient here is everybody needs to be on the same page, more or less. Of course, you encourage differences of opinion with operational matters and things like that. But generally speaking, in terms of the cultural change, you need everybody on the same page, pulling in the one direction. And of course, as I recruited and replaced those people, um, I was recruiting against a certain paradigm. And I made very sure that a big part of the interview process was those people completely understanding what sort of organization they were coming into and their role in further building the culture that we wanted. And in many ways, um, what I was attempting to demonstrate myself as the most senior leader in the company and I was recruiting against was a framework of values. So I was really saying to people, I'm not just looking for somebody who's, a great CFO or a great CIO or whatever. What I'm looking for is somebody that has all of those skills, but is also keen to take on the challenge with me and their peers in the executive team of really transforming this company culturally. Now, it it's not always the case that just because you are good at finance, good at IT, et cetera, good at HR, good at legal, that you have the skills or the sensitivity to bring a much more nuanced approach to the management of people in the organization. And I had to find those people, but also really what you have to do as the most senior person, if this is the vision you're driving, is you have to constantly reinforce that message. It's absolutely not set and forget. You do not come up with 5 or 6 values, put them in a frame, put them on the wall, and then kind of go, well, job done. It's anything but that. And I found myself constantly, for instance, visiting the branches. We were doing town hall style meetings. I was sharing results with people, which was part of the improved communication. I was telling them when we had good months and didn't have good months, telling them about contract wins, which I'd never heard about any of these things before because they were treated more as a tool in the business of
Mm.
performing a function at their desk. Um, but one of the things I did, for instance, and it took me a while to get around to doing this to realize the importance of it, but I went to every branch and I spent an extra day there on this particular, tour. And that was in order that I could meet with all of the women in that branch. I wanted to meet with everybody, every female member of our organization. And I wanted to ask them one very simple question. What is it like to be a woman working in this company? Because I can't possibly know that.
Mhm.
Please tell me. And I made another very big mistake at this point too. And I sort of cringe and laugh about this at the same time. And that is that in making these arrangements, I said to each state man, or I started with 1 or 2 state managers, and I said, hey, maybe I can take them all out for breakfast on my second, day in the state. You're smiling because you probably know what's wrong with that. And
Yeah,
that is
they're
breakfast is
dealing with kids and school drop
absolutely
off and whatever.
the worst time for women, particularly with children, um, to have a meeting with me. And that showed that I had blind spots still. I was learning on the job.
Yeah.
And so of course we went to lunch, or we met in a meeting room and had catering come in the office, or whatever they chose. I left that up to them. Um, but then they told me what it was like to be a woman. And I was this was off the back of the Australian Human Rights Commission report that was done by Kate Jenkins, and Safe at Work, I think the report was called, the study. And I was really wanting to know, might we have any pockets of sexual harassment or intimidation or um, bullying going on, or things of that nature, which would transcend the gender of necessarily just females. But I wanted to start there as a particularly potentially vulnerable group. It didn't unearth any of those things, but what came up quite regularly is what we called everyday sexism. And a classic example that women would tell, I think every branch had this story, was look, well, we have a meeting, we have several meetings a day sometimes. Often people will take tea and coffee into the meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, all the men get up, they walk out, and they leave their coffee and teacups on the table in the meeting room, with kind of a subconscious assumption that the women in the meeting will probably clean up and take those to our lunchroom or internal cafe and put them in the dishwasher or whatever. Because, hey, maybe that's what had happened all their lives. Maybe their mum cleaned up after them. Maybe their wife cleans up after them or whatever. So I then started to feed these stories back to the blokes. And I said, just keep an eye on your behavior. There's probably a lot of unconscious bias going on in this organization, and it kind of offends people. And it's just not right. It's not who we are. Come on, we can be a more enlightened, progressive company than that. But then it extended to things like, jokes being told with some racial overtones or ethnic, reflecting on a particular ethnic group or whatever. So we just we just it was through contact with people, it was through me getting out of the office. And I absolutely preach this to boards. If you're on a board, particularly ASX listed company or whatever, don't just turn up once a month for a board meeting and make a beeline from the lift to the boardroom, sit in there for the day or whatever, and then jump in the lift. Turn up early, go to the lunchroom, sit there, have a cup of coffee, go over to somebody who's already sitting there on their break and say, look, I'm one of the directors. I'm here for a board meeting, but I'm a bit early. Would you mind if I sit down and we have a chat? I'd love to hear a little bit about, how you perceive the company's going or whatever. And go around Australia like I did. Boards have to seek the approval of the executive who are running the company, but it can be done respectfully. And get out there and speak to people. Go and speak to customers. I seem to remember years ago when Gail Kelly ran Westpac, she used to spend a morning, I think it was a morning a month, and she'd go to branches and kind of stand in the queue with the customers and say, "Oh, hi, I'm Gail Kelly. I'm the managing director of the bank.
Yeah.
Just as we move closer to the teller and you're about to get served, can I just ask you, what's your experience as a customer?" That stuff is gold. And
Mm.
I don't think that people to people cold face contact is done enough in business.
It is not, and it's done less and less post COVID as people retreat to their little enclaves of hiding behind cameras and nesting in their own world if they possibly can. And I get it. Like I get why people want to work more from home. I do. I have an office in my own home because it's comfortable, it's easy, it's private, whatever. And you often have less interruptions. And yet you miss out on the gold as you describe it. Now, David, we've talked a lot about internal mechanisms of kindness in business and how to restructure the values and principles and therefore the actions and physical structures of a business to be kind. A big part of what you did at Konica Minolta and what you are doing now as a consultant is bringing ESG, environment, social governance principles to be embedded in a business. Can you please talk to how this principle of being a kind, caring business evolved into beyond the company walls into something greater?
Yeah, well, look, what we did at Konica Minolta just fell out of that original statement where I said I
Mhm.
want us to. Um, did I mention this at the beginning of the podcast? When I first stepped up on stage, I said I want us all to work together to build a company that
Yeah.
cares about the people who work here. So we've talked about some of those initiatives. Care about our customers, and that was about honesty and transparency and openness, and cares about our community. So that third pillar that also
Mm.
needed to be addressed. It was regarded as important as the others. But we had a very, in a way, fortuitous occurrence, a bit of serendipity. We used to have an annual conference overseas where the top performers and their partners and our top dealers were invited to attend, and there was a gala awards night for, the top manager of the year and that kind of thing. And there'd always be a keynote speaker. My first year, we decided the conference would be in Cambodia, and I'd never been there, and we didn't know who we'd get as a keynote speaker in Cambodia. But a woman was recommended to me, um, who had been trafficked into a life of sexual slavery, um, was able to extricate herself from that. She married a French man in Cambodia, and they moved to Paris, and she decided she had a great life now, but she had to go back. They had to go back, and so they went back and founded an organization called AFISIP, AFESIP, which is a French acronym for Assisting Women in Distressing Situations. And and we had to come along as a keynote and talk about her work. And I was a bit hesitant at first because it's kind of an upbeat awards night and everyone's clapping and the top performers and rah, rah, rah. And here we were talking about this, terrible kind of situation that was going on, the exploitation of young women. But I was told by the person who recommended Somali Ma'am, it was the speaker's name, that there was at the end of the tunnel. It was a very, very powerful and moving and positive story. So we went, okay. Um, and it was. And she brought 5 young women along with her who had been rescued in the past and had now gone through a process of rehabilitation and had actually qualified for university and were in their first year of university, studying nursing and accounting and psychology and various disciplines. And we decided on the spot. There's an expression in the human rights world, which is once you know, you can't unknow.
Mm.
Once you've seen, you can't unsee. You can't take
Mm.
it back. So there we were, meeting the first people who had been enslaved that we'd ever met in our lives.
Mm.
And we decided on the spot, well, they're going to be a charity partner. And we started to fund for years ahead university scholarships and funding for kids to go to high schools and laptops for the young people at uni. And so that was 5 initially. I went back at the start of this year, and because I've stayed in touch with the organization, and there were now 20 currently at first year university going through. So it was a
Mm.
very successful intervention where a little bit of money was able to absolutely change lives. And that kind of propelled us into more of a societal focus, I guess. And it even from there took us from, I guess, what you could call sort of standard corporate social responsibility with charity partners and volunteering days off and salary match giving and things like that, into really some human rights advocacy. And we realized that slavery wasn't just the exploitation of young women in the sex industry, but um, there was slavery in corporate supply chains as well.
Mm.
Many, many people enslaved in factories, making the things that we used in our business. And we became very strong advocates for ethical sourcing.
This is all fabulous, and your research, your experience shows that being a caring business is both profitable and meaningful. Why don't more businesses do that? Why do not more businesses embrace this idea of kindness and integrating these practices into the fabric of their enterprise?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The question should be, how come there are still a few organizations that don't get this? But it's not. It's, how come there are only a few organizations that really get it? Now,
Mm.
I'm not saying that Konica Minolta was the best company in the world, or I was the best managing director, or a lot of other companies aren't doing good things. I mean, most ASX companies now understand the power of ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations, and they are doing things to some extent. We hope that most have moved beyond just mere compliance and box ticking, um, and they are, doing things more meaningfully. However, I think one of the impediments really is what in the book, in Kind Business, I call the curse of the capitalist system, and that
Mhm.
is short-termism.
Mm.
Everybody running a company in Australia is under pressure to produce more profit, to grow their market share, to move, smash their competitors, if you want to start using aggressive kind of corporate language, um, and to meet growth expectations of the board, which typically are set, monthly or quarterly or certainly annually. And then there are investment analysts that are either going to recommend that people whose portfolios they're managing, um, invest in your stocks or don't invest in your stocks. So this short-term obsession with growth and profit, I think, gets in the way. What more enlightened leaders have realized is that if you just take a longer term view, and I'm not talking about way out in the future, but just lift your gaze to the horizon a little bit more, get out of the day to day weeds of every day, how much did we make yesterday? Just lift your gaze a little bit more and take a slightly longer term view, and then you bring in these elements of now let's get a focus on culture. Now let's get a focus on treating our suppliers well. Let's get a focus on being honest with our customers. Then what you suddenly find is that you are achieving all of those profit objectives and growth objectives, but not through focusing on the growth. It's through focusing on the things that nourish growth. Um, and just a couple of quick stories. We started to win very large contracts with companies that had never spent a dollar with us in 40 years in our whole time in Australia. And sometimes I'd be involved in the tender process up front, sometimes I wouldn't. But in each case, when they advised us that we were their preferred supplier, I would go and meet with that decision maker, and I'd say something along the lines of, um, thank you very much for choosing us as your technology supplier. We, of course, think you've made a very good decision. We think we're a very good company. But can you tell me, why did you choose us? It's kind of an odd question in a way, but um, and typically they would all say something like, look, we had a tender evaluation team. We went to market because our governance processes require us to. We found everybody's equipment was about the same, multifunction printing and scanning devices on corporate networks. We found everybody's service levels were about the same. They're all fine. Everybody's pricing was about the same. So at that point, there was no reason to change suppliers. We're happy with our current supplier. Why go through the pain of transformation? Different network protocols, and staff have to get used to different control panels and drivers and things like that. So we typically we would not have changed. However, our governance processes now include ESG considerations. And as the procurement arm of this company, we are required not just to look at what it is you're trying to sell us, we're required to look at who you are. Very powerful statement.
Mm.
And one man said to me, when we looked under the hood, everybody presented as the bright new shiny car. But when we looked under the hood, we found big differences. And what we found was that Konica Minolta's values and our values are aligned. And we think that you're a really good fit for us. And that's why we've given you the contract. And we think we'll probably remain in a partnership for a long while to come.
Mm.
And it's beautiful to win
Mm.
big pieces of commercial work for that reason.
Mm.
Not you were the cheapest or you had an
Mm.
extra, button on your machine or whatever.
That's awesome. David,
Yeah.
are you ready for the fast three?
Go for it. You've made me nervous, but yeah, let's give it a go.
I'm laughing because so far, every time I do the fast three, it turns into an epic. So we'll see how we go.
I'll give you fast answers.
Okay. Number one, what is the future technology you most want right now?
Okay. What I want is ethical AI, ethical artificial intelligence. We have artificial intelligence. It's in every aspect of our lives pretty much now. But I think where it's lacking and where I want it to catch up and what I want, and I want us all to have, is AI with moral and ethical human-like considerations built into it.
Mm, I like that. Okay, number two, best tip you ever got for leadership.
Oh, I think the best tip I ever got was to follow your North Star. So that's the analogy of the old-fashioned way they used to sailing ships. They'd point the sextant at the North Star, and they knew they had to sail against that on that course. And if they deviated by even a few degrees, then they'd go off course. And so I think it's a great analogy for any leader, particularly when you first move into, senior management ranks. Set your North Star, set your sextant against the North Star. Find out what is your North Star, where is it, and North Star can equate to your values, and never get on that slippery slope of compromise or what's called situational morality, where you do this to begin with, but business conditions toughen up, or a new competitor enters the market, or you're getting more heat from the board, or whatever it might be, and you just start to compromise. Never do that. That's where you've moved a few degrees from true north. You got to stay aligned to your North Star and have the courage just to stay the course at all times, no matter how strong the headwinds or the criticism might be.
Mm,
So I think the North Star analogy's always stood me in good stead.
love it. All right, I love a good navigation metaphor. Number three, what are you reading or listening to right now?
Oh, can I hold up a book?
Yeah.
I have several books on this table, and one of them is the one I'm reading right now, and the others are what I'm going to read afterwards. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's called The Buddhist and the Ethicist.
Mm,
So it's a conversation between Peter Singer and Shi Chao Wei, who's a Buddhist monk. And Peter Singer is an Australian man. He's professor of ethics at Princeton, and probably the world's most renowned ethicist that we have at the moment. And so that's the book that I'm reading, and it's basically about integrating Western ethics, I guess, and the more Buddhist philosophies of compassion and so on. And it's a great book. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm very happy to recommend it to anybody.
I love it. And I think ethics in leadership is a very underrated aspect of leadership. It doesn't get a lot of visibility. So I love it. Thank you, David. That was the fast three.
Good.
Now, David, what have we left unsaid? What is something that you'd like to share with the listeners that we haven't said yet?
Oh, okay. Look, perhaps just a short story to finish off. I mentioned if you like, the evidence that kindness and consideration for people leads to better commercial outcomes in my story about the awarding of contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it also leads to internal transformation, which I alluded to on several occasions. And I spoke about some of our initiatives, but perhaps I'd like to speak about um, evidence as to just how powerful it can be. And this story, which I like to tell, is after I'd been the managing director for a little while, I invited everybody who'd been in the company for 25 years or more to come to Sydney, and I took them out to dinner just to say thank you. A cheap and cheerful suburban restaurant, about a dozen people, and they were actually all field service engineers. So those people who may be working from offices, they'll know that from time to time, your pesky multifunction device that you print to or scan from fails you, and you ring up a 1-3 number, and in comes the person in the branded uniform usually, and they fix it. So those people. And at the end of the meal, we were about to leave, and one man said, "Could I please say something?" And I said, "Of course." And he stood up in the middle of this public restaurant. Others Other diners turned around to see what was going on. And this was a very quiet man who had not spoken all evening. Clearly a very thoughtful man as well. And he'd done a lot more listening than talking. And he said, I've worked in this organization for more than 25 years. And for 25 years, I never told anybody where I worked. I just didn't see the point. It was just a job that I went to, and I did a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. And that's how I fed my family for 25 years. Now, I tell every single person I meet that I work for Konica Minolta. And why would I do that? I do that because I feel so proud to work for an organization that would care about young women on the other side of the world who have been trafficked into a life of sexual slavery. Now, we did those initiatives to support those young women in Cambodia simply because it was the right thing to do. We saw no commercial connection or even cultural connection at all. We just responded to a need in the way that I think a good moral, organization or group of people should. But what had happened is that this man had gone from disengaged. So the company was good enough to stay, but he wasn't really engaged. And his engagement dial, if you like, went from disengaged to fully engaged. And it kept going to the point where he became a public advocate for our company several times a day, wherever he went. And that type of advocacy and authentic advocacy, it shows, all the different offices he went into, our different clients, that many of them probably said to him, oh, what sort of company is it like that you work for? And then he spoke with pride in his voice. I mean, anybody that's managed people will know the holy grail is to get everybody fully engaged, pulling together on the same page, enjoying the work that they're doing, but it's not easy. And I've never seen anything more powerful in all my time in the corporate world to bring meaning into people's lives than when an organization decides that it wants to be an organization that cares.
Oh my God, that has me just welling up. Thank you so much, David. And I'm so grateful for you, A, coming on the show, B, for doing the fabulous work that you did at Konica Minolta and now in your own consultancy, helping other organizations and leaders embrace ESG principles and weaving kindness into the fabric of their businesses, because the ripple effect, as you have illustrated with story after story, is immense. And it takes a little bit of courage with the kindness to create that kind of effect. So thank you for all of what you do and all of who you are. This has been such a blessing to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Well, it's very, very kind of you, Zoe, and thank you for giving a platform to share my ideas. And if people do decide to pick up a copy of Kind Business, then they'll see that philosophy further expanded there as well. And yeah, look, together we can all just make the world a kinder place.
It's Read to Lead. And this week we have a beautiful book by Dr. David Cooke, who is a wonderful human, and it is Kind Business: Values Create Value. It's a wonderful manuscript, testament, manifesto about how we can embed values of kindness as a core principle in our business efforts. It means bringing ethical decision making to everything that we do, everything from our choices of how we interact with staff, how we interact with the community, our choices of vendors, and how we run our business. Sounds pie in the sky, and yet David's research and his own experience demonstrate what a tangible difference it makes to the business bottom line when we act with kindness as one of our central values. It's not just aspirational, it's practical. And I think this is a calling card, a clarion call for all of us to do better with our business. And David's leading the way, highly recommended. It's an awesome read that is uplifting as well as inspiring and practical. Kind Business. Well, that's it for this week. I do hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please rate and review our show. But even better is to make sure you don't miss any episodes. Click subscribe in your podcasting app, and you'll make sure you get the roll as it comes through week after week with new episodes, new interviews, and new insights on the future of leadership. Failing that, I would love to turn our relationship into something deeper. So please do sign up as a podcast insider. You'll get really cool extras like an implementation sheet or a tip sheet, whatever is relevant for the topic of the week. And you'll get discussion questions that you can share with your team to take the ideas further and explore what it could mean for you. You get the water cooler factoids, which are some interesting facts and tidbits to make you look smarty at any party. And it's a way of staying in contact and also getting some extra resources and special offers for you podcast insiders. So you can sign up at my website, zoerouth.com, click on podcast, and just pop your name and email in the boxes right there. I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, zoe@zoerouth.com, or drop a comment on any of the socials. I'm there quite frequently, especially LinkedIn. Or send me another message like this one from listener Joe. I can't read it without my glasses. She says, nice rebrand and tweaks to format. Love your point of view up front. Thank you. Fast 3, better. They're never fast, but they're fast enough for me. No, they're not really fast, but I'm trying. Love it. Your constant reinvention inspires me. Well, thank you, Joe. And your comments really motivate me. So if you have some comments, whether what you love or what you don't love about the show, I'd love to hear from them. I'd love to hear them from you. Okay, that's it for now. In the meantime, live with grace, lead in service, live well, lead well.